Claire moved through the fluorescent-lit corridors of Donovan International like a ghost in the machine. It was 3:15 a.m., the hour when the hospital's expensive facade began to peel away, revealing the exhausted, raw nerves of the night shift. In her oversized scrubs, with her hair pulled into a severe, utilitarian bun, she was invisible. To the senior surgeons, she was a furniture mover. To the floor supervisors, she was a pair of hands to be worked until they cramped. She knelt on the cold linoleum of a storage closet, counting inventory. Most people in her position, fresh out of an Ivy League nursing program with a trust fund that could buy a fleet of private jets, would be vacationing in the Maldives or at least working in a clean, high-prestige wing of the hospital. But Claire had insisted on the Donovan rotation. For 90 days she had scrubbed the floors of the trauma bays after a code blue left them stained with the remnants of a struggle for life. She had taken the double shifts in the overcrowded psych ward and the thankless tasks in the geriatric wing that made other rookies quit within a week. Her father, Thomas, had called it a suicide mission for the soul. But Claire knew it was the only way to see the truth. From the top floor, looking down through a mahogany-lined office, the hospital looked like a triumph of philanthropy. From the ground floor, it looked like a sinking ship where the officers were stealing the lifeboats. She remembered her first week, when she'd watched a veteran nurse, Sarah, break down in the break room because she'd been denied a weekend off to see her daughter's graduation. "Whitfield needs the A-team on standby for his elective surgeries," the supervisor had said with a shrug. "His billables keep the lights on." Claire had sat in the corner, sipping lukewarm coffee, her heart burning with a quiet, icy rage. She had seen the way the Golden Boy surgeons treated the support staff. Not as colleagues, but as disposable equipment. "Donovan! Stop daydreaming and get to room 412. A voice barked. It was head nurse Miller, a woman whose empathy had been cauterized years ago by the hospital's relentless pursuit of efficiency over care. "There's a spill, and the janitorial crew is backed up. Move it!" Claire didn't argue. She didn't mention that she had just finished a 12-hour shift, or that her back ached from lifting a bariatric patient 2 hours prior. She simply grabbed the mop bucket. As she pushed the yellow cart down the hallway, she passed a portrait of her father hanging near the elevators. His eyes seemed to follow her, a silent reminder of the weight she carried. To the world, he was the king of this empire. To her, he was the man who had taught her that a foundation built on a lie would eventually crumble. She reached room 412 and began to work. Each stroke of the mop was a lesson. She listened to the whispered conversations of the residents in the hall, recording every complaint about equipment shortages and every story of a covered-up mistake in a mental ledger. She was the shadow in the corner, the mouse, who saw everything and said nothing. For 90 days she had played the part of the submissive rookie, absorbing the insults and the exhaustion. She had let Dr. Whitfield look through her, as if she were made of glass. She had allowed the system to grind her down, waiting for the moment when the rot would finally show its face in the light of day. Her hands were calloused, and her eyes were tired, but her resolve had never been sharper. The invisible heiress was almost done watching. Soon, it would be time for her to act. As the sun began to bleed over the Seattle skyline, Claire emptied the bucket one last time. She caught her reflection in the darkened glass of the nurse's station. She didn't see a billionaire or a victim. She saw a Donovan. And she knew that the storm she was bringing would wash this hospital cleaner than any mop ever could. Dr. Marcus Whitfield did not walk through the hospital. He presided over it. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the surgical wing, the atmosphere shifted from the weary exhaustion of the night shift to a brittle, frantic energy. The mere sound of his Italian leather loafers clicking against the polished floor acted like a silent alarm, sending interns scurrying and causing veteran nurses to stiffen their posture. To the board of directors, Whitfield was a rainmaker, a man whose God-given hands brought in the kind of high-profile donors and elective surgery revenue that built new wings and funded gala dinners. To everyone else, he was a predator in a white coat. He moved with a predatory grace, surrounded by a wake of terrified residents who clutched tablets like shields. Whitfield didn't look at people. He looked through them, evaluating their utility to his immediate needs. His reputation for perfection was a shield he used to deflect any scrutiny. Over the last decade, he had cultivated an air of untouchability that made even the chief of medicine hesitate to question his mounting list of surgical complications, which were always conveniently blamed on the nursing staff or the patient's own biology. Claire stood by the nurse's station, her gloved hands busy sorting post-op charts, though her ears were tuned to the wake of tension Whitfield left behind. She watched as he stopped in front of a young resident, a brilliant kid named Heiress who had worked 36 hours straight. Whitfield didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he plucked a chart from Heiress's hand with a flick of his wrist, his eyes scanning the notes for a fraction of a second before he let out a short, cold laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "This dosage, Heiress," Whitfield said, his voice a smooth, dangerous baritone that carried easily across the quiet hall. "Is this a medical plan or a suicide note? If I hadn't caught this, the patient would be in the morgue before lunch." Heiress turned a shade of gray. "Sir, I followed the protocol for the—" "Protocol is for people who lack instinct," Whitfield interrupted, leaning into the younger man's space. The power dynamic was visceral. Whitfield towered over him, radiating an entitlement that felt heavy in the air. "You're lucky my name is on this wing, because it's the only reason your incompetence hasn't cost us a lawsuit today. Fix it. And if I see your face in my or before you've learned to read a chart, don't bother coming back." The cruelty was the point. It wasn't about the medicine, it was about the dominance. Claire felt a familiar coldness settling in her chest. She had seen this type of man before, men who mistook their position for a divine right to humiliate others. As Whitfield turned away, dismissing the trembling resident like a broken tool, his gaze briefly snagged on Claire. For a heartbeat he paused, his eyes raking over her rookie badge and her unassuming posture. He saw a girl who was supposed to be afraid. He saw a nobody who existed only to facilitate his brilliance. "Donovan," he barked, not bothering to learn if she was a nurse or an orderly. "My coffee is cold, and the trauma bay looks like a slaughterhouse. If you want to keep that badge, start acting like you're worth the air you're breathing." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. In his world, Claire was just part of the scenery, a ghost in blue scrubs. He was the god of this temple, and he had no idea that the woman he had just insulted was currently calculating the exact cost of his downfall. As he disappeared into the elevator, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. It just settled into a low, vibrating fear. Claire looked down at the charts in her hand, her grip tightening just enough to crinkle the paper. She had seen enough. The god of surgery was about to find out what happened when a mortal decided to stop worshipping. The blacked-out Mercedes Maybach sat idling in the furthest corner of the hospital's basement parking structure, a sleek shadow among the concrete pillars. Claire checked her shoulder one last time before slipping into the back seat. The transition from the harsh, antiseptic glare of the ER to the scent of expensive leather and aged scotch was jarring, a physical reminder of the two worlds she was currently straddling. In the corner of the seat, Thomas Donovan sat with a tablet glowing in his lap. He looked every bit the patriarch of a multi-billion-dollar healthcare empire, but as the door clicked shut, the professional mask softened into the worried face of a father. He didn't speak immediately. He simply reached out and took Claire's hand, his thumb brushing over the new callus on her palm from a week of gripping mops and oxygen tanks. "You look exhausted, Claire," he said, his voice a low rumble. "There are dark circles under your eyes that no amount of Donovan money can fix. Is this still worth it?" Claire leaned her head back against the headrest, closing her eyes. "It's worse than the reports said, Dad. The staff isn't just tired, they're broken. And the man breaking them is Marcus Whitfield." Thomas sighed, darkening the screen of his tablet. "Whitfield's department brings in 40% of our surgical revenue. The board sees him as a visionary. They see his perfectionism as a safeguard against liability. It's not perfectionism. It's a reign of terror, Claire countered, her voice regaining its edge. She opened her eyes, turning to look at her father. He's a predator who hides behind his billing codes. I've watched him humiliate residents until they're too terrified to report his mistakes. I've seen him ignore nurses who catch his errors because he thinks they're beneath him. He's not a safeguard, Dad. He's a ticking time bomb, and when he finally explodes, he's going to take the Donovan name down with him. Thomas looked out the tinted window at the rows of staff cars, beaten-up sedans and modest hatchbacks belonging to the people his daughter had been working alongside. The board won't move against him without undeniable proof of medical negligence. His father is a senator, and his legal team is a pack of wolves. If we miss, he'll sue for defamation and gut our reputation. I'm not just looking for a mistake, Claire said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I'm building a dossier. I've been recording the near misses, the cases that never make it into the official logs because the nurses are too scared to file the paperwork. I'm the ghost in his oar, Dad. He doesn't even see me, which means he isn't hiding anything from me. Thomas reached into a side compartment and pulled out a slim, encrypted flash drive. He held it out to her, his expression grim. This contains the internal audit logs from the last 5 years. There are gaps in the surgical outcomes, anomalies that the chief of medicine flagged but never followed up on. If you find a pattern, Claire, I'll back you. But you have to be careful. If Whitfield finds out who you are before we have him cornered, he'll find a way to discredit you as a spoiled heiress playing doctor. Claire took the drive, the cold metal pressing into her skin. He already thinks I'm a nobody. That's his greatest weakness. He thinks the people in blue scrubs don't have a voice. She reached for the door handle, the invisible heiress, preparing to submerge herself back into the depths of the hospital. By the time he realizes I'm a Donovan, it'll be because I'm the one signing his termination papers. Thomas watched her step out into the cold dampness of the garage. Claire, he called out softly. She paused, looking back. Don't lose yourself in the dark. Your mother didn't build those hospitals so her daughter would have to hide in the shadows to save them. I'm not hiding, Dad, Claire replied, a small, cold smile touching her lips. I'm hunting. She closed the door with a muted thud and disappeared back toward the service elevator, leaving the billionaire alone in the dark. The shift started like any other, a heavy humidity in the air and the low hum of machines, until the red trauma lights began to pulse with a frantic, rhythmic urgency. The radio crackled with a high priority. Code Crimson, a signal reserved for the most catastrophic arrivals. Outside, the wail of sirens cut through the city noise, growing louder until a fleet of ambulances and black SUVs screeched into the ambulance bay. Claire was already moving toward Trauma Bay 1, snapping on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. The air in the ER shifted instantly. The casual chatter died, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of adrenaline. When the gurney burst through the double doors, it was surrounded by a phalanx of paramedics and 2 suits in dark earpieces who looked entirely out of place in a hospital. 74-year-old male, massive myocardial infarction, found unresponsive in his office. The lead paramedic shouted over the din. We've got a rhythm, but it's thready. He's crashing. Claire stepped forward to assist with the transfer, but as she caught sight of the patient's face, the breath died in her throat. It wasn't just a VIP. It was Arthur Sterling. The man who had held her when she was a baby, the man who had been her father's business partner and closest confidant for 40 years. To the world, he was the titan of sterling steel. To Claire, he was Uncle Arthur. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her training to take over. Her rookie mask stayed firmly in place, even as her mind raced through Arthur's medical history, details she knew from private dinners, not charts. She knew he had a chronic sensitivity to common anticoagulants, a detail that could be fatal in a cardiac crisis. I need a full secondary assessment, a sharp, authoritative voice barked. Dr. Whitfield strode into the bay, his white coat billowing behind him like a cape. He didn't look at the patient as a human being. He looked at him like a trophy. He had clearly been briefed on who was on the table. This was the kind of high-stakes save that made front-page news and secured multi-million-dollar endowments. "Out of the way, Donovan!" Whitfield snapped, shoving past Claire so roughly she hit the equipment cart. "This is a Sterling. I don't want your clumsy hands anywhere near him. Go find some blankets or something equally suited to your pay grade." Claire steadied herself, her eyes burning. She watched as Whitfield began shouting orders for a standard aggressive thrombolytic protocol, the exact treatment that would trigger a massive, uncontrollable internal hemorrhage in a man with Arthur's specific physiology. "Doctor," Claire said, her voice low but steady, vibrating with a command she usually reserved for the boardroom. "You need to check his history for heparin sensitivity before you push that. You are a first-year nurse at a hospital you're lucky to be working in. I am the man who is going to save this billionaire's life. If you speak again, I'll have you escorted out of this building by security. Do you understand?" Claire looked at Arthur's pale, sweat-slicked face. She looked at the syringe in the resident's hand, hovering over the foreport. She could feel the weight of the Donovan name tag under her scrubs, the secret power she held, and the crushing responsibility to protect the man on the table. "I understand perfectly, Doctor," Claire said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a threat. She backed away, but she didn't leave. She retreated to the corner of the room, her hands sliding into her pocket to grip her phone. The time for being invisible was rapidly coming to an end. The atmosphere in Trauma Bay 1 was thick with a tension so sharp it felt like it could draw blood. Arthur Sterling's monitor began to wail, a frantic, jagged rhythm that signaled the onset of ventricular tachycardia. The medical team moved in a choreographed blur, but at the center of the storm stood Dr. Whitfield, his face flushed with a dark, triumphant heat. He was no longer just treating a patient. He was defending his throne against the perceived insolence of a subordinate. 10 milligrams of tenecteplase, now! Whitfield commanded, his voice booming over the alarms. The resident hesitated, his hand hovering over the drug tray. "Sir, Nurse Donovan mentioned a sensitivity." "Nurse Donovan is a first-year rookie who likely can't tell a heart attack from a heartburn," Whitfield roared, snatching the medical charts from the bedside rail with such force the metal rings groaned. He didn't even look at the pages. He thrust them back at the resident's chest. "I have performed more cardiac clearances than she has seen patients. Do not let her delusions of adequacy interfere with my orders. Push the meds." Claire stepped forward, her heart thundering against her ribs. She wasn't thinking about her undercover status anymore. She was thinking about the summer Arthur Sterling had taught her how to sail, and the way his laugh sounded before his heart started to fail him. "Dr. Whitfield, look at his history," Claire said, her voice dropping into a cold, clinical register that momentarily stunned the room into silence. "He has a documented heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. If you push those thrombolytics without a bridge, you aren't saving him." He lunged across the narrow space, grabbing the chart from the resident and slamming it onto the rolling tray next to Claire. "You want to play Dr. Donovan? You want to tell me how to run my department?" He stepped into her personal space, the scent of expensive cologne and sterile soap clashing unpleasantly. "You are a fly on the wall. You are here to fetch blankets and keep your mouth shut. If you utter one more word, I will personally see to it that you never work in a hospital again. Not even as a janitor." "I am trying to save his life," Claire said, her gaze never wavering from his. "You are trying to stroke your own ego at the expense of a legend," Whitfield hissed. He turned back to the resident, his voice a snarl. "Push it. Now." "That is a direct order from the chief of trauma." The resident, terrified of the man who held his career in his hands, didn't look at Claire. He injected the medication into Arthur's foreline. For 3 seconds the room was silent, save for the mechanical hiss of the ventilator. Then the monitor didn't just wail, it flatlined into a continuous, soul-crushing drone. Arthur's body convulsed once, his eyes rolling back. Almost immediately, Dark bruising began to bloom like ink across his chest and arms, the unmistakable sign of a catastrophic internal bleed. "He's crashing!" someone screamed. "BP is bottoming out! 30/10/20. Whitfield's face went from flushed to a sickly, ashen white. He looked down at his hands, then at the monitor, his brilliant mind suddenly paralyzed by the one thing he never thought possible. He was wrong. The god of surgery stood frozen as Arthur's life began to leak out of his veins, his arrogance finally meeting a reality it couldn't bully. Claire didn't wait for him to recover. She didn't wait for an apology. She shoved the equipment cart aside and stepped into the vacuum of leadership. The rookie was gone. In her place stood the woman who had been groomed since birth to take command in a crisis. "Get me a crash cart and 2 units of O negative," Claire shouted, her voice cutting through the panic like a blade. "Whitfield, get out of the way. You've done enough." The continuous, shrill whistle of the flatline felt like it was drilling into the skulls of everyone in the room. In the clinical world, that sound is the boundary between a person and a corpse, and right now, Arthur Sterling was slipping across it. Dr. Whitfield, the man who had built a career on unshakable confidence, looked like a statue carved from salt. His hands, usually so steady, were hovering inches above Arthur's chest, twitching with a paralysis born of pure, unadulterated shock. He had pushed the meds. He had ignored the warning. And now the god of surgery was watching his empire collapse into a puddle of ink-dark blood on the linoleum. "He's in PA, pulseless electrical activity," someone yelled, but the trauma team was drifting into chaos, looking to their leader for a command that wasn't coming. "Whitfield, move!" Claire's voice didn't just break the silence, it shattered it. She didn't ask permission. She stepped into the space Whitfield had vacated, her movements fluid and lethal in their precision. She didn't look like a rookie nurse anymore. The submissive slump of her shoulders was gone, replaced by a terrifyingly focused authority. "Heiress, get on chest compressions. 2 inches deep, 100 beats a minute, follow the metronome," she commanded. The resident, snapping out of his stupor by the sheer force of her will, began to pump Arthur's chest. "Sarah, get the reversal agent for the thrombolytics. I need 10 milligrams of protamine sulfate pushed immediately to stop this hemorrhage. Now!" "But the protocol," a nurse began to protest. "The protocol just killed him," Claire barked, her eyes never leaving the monitor. "We are off book now. Push the protamine and prep the crash cart for a second shock. I'm taking over the airway." Whitfield finally found his voice, though it was weak and cracking. You can't. You're just a nurse. You're not authorized to perform a..." "I'm the only one in this room actually practicing medicine right now," Claire snapped, her hands moving with a speed that left the staff breathless. She grabbed the intubation kit, her technique so flawless it looked like she'd done it 1,000 times in a high-intensity simulation. "Charge the paddles to 200 joules. Everyone clear!" The room jumped as Arthur's body arched under the current. The flat line remained. Claire didn't flinch. Again. "Increase to 300. Heiress, keep the rhythm. Don't stop." For 3 agonizing minutes, Claire orchestrated a symphony of life-saving measures that surpassed anything the staff had ever seen. She wasn't just following orders, she was predicting the physiological cascades before they happened, adjusting the vasopressors with the surgical intuition of a 30-year veteran. She looked like a woman who had spent her life preparing for this exact moment, the moment where the Donovan in her blood met the crisis head-on. "I've got a rhythm," Heiress whispered, his voice trembling. "We've got a rhythm. Sinus touch, but it's holding. Pressure is climbing, 60/40, 80/50. The jagged peaks and valleys returned to the monitor, the most beautiful music Claire had ever heard. She stepped back, her scrubs stained with the blood of her father's friend, her chest heaving as the adrenaline began to recede. Arthur was stable, but the air in the room remained electrified. The trauma team turned as one to look at the rookie. They saw the blood on her face, the steady fire in her eyes, and the way she stood, unafraid and unmatched. Beside her, Whitfield was still staring at the floor, his professional mask shattered beyond repair. "He's stable for transport to the ICU," Claire said, her voice dropping back into a calm, icy tone. She looked directly at Whitfield, who finally raised his head. "But don't get comfortable, doctor. The emergency isn't over. It's just moving from the trauma bay to the boardroom." The adrenaline in the trauma bay was beginning to cool, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Arthur Sterling was breathing, his heart beating in a fragile but steady rhythm on the monitor, but the air in the room remained thick with the scent of an impending storm. Claire stood over the gurney, her hands still steady despite the blood on her sleeves, while the rest of the medical team looked at her with a mixture of awe and terror. They had just witnessed a miracle, but in the hierarchy of Donovan International, miracles performed by subordinates were often treated as crimes. Dr. Whitfield was the first to move. The shock that had paralyzed him during the flatline had curdled into a desperate, feral rage. He saw his career, his reputation, and his untouchable status flashing before his eyes. If the story of this resuscitation got out, if it was recorded that a rookie nurse had saved a titan of industry after the chief of trauma had nearly killed him, Whitfield would be finished. "Step away from the patient," Whitfield said, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a calculated, venomous intent. Claire didn't move. "He needs to be moved to the ICU immediately, doctor. The protamine is holding, but he's not out of the woods. I said step away." Whitfield roared, lunging forward to grab Claire by the shoulder and wrench her back. He turned to the two security guards who had been hovering near the door since the VIP's arrival. "Arrest her. Now." The trauma team gasped. Heiress, the resident, stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Sir, she saved him. We all saw it. If she hadn't..." "She practiced medicine without a license," Whitfield screamed, his face a mask of frantic entitlement. "She interfered with a chief surgeon's orders, administered unauthorized medication, and physically assaulted a superior officer of this hospital. She is a danger to the patients and a liability to this institution. I want her in handcuffs and I want her out of my sight." The security guards hesitated, looking from the sweating, wild-eyed surgeon to the calm, blood-stained nurse. But Whitfield was a power player. He sat on committees that decided their paychecks. One of the guards, a man named Henderson who had seen Claire scrubbing floors for weeks, reached for his belt. "Donovan, don't make this harder than it has to be," Henderson muttered, his voice full of regret as he pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his pouch. Claire didn't fight. She didn't scream or plead. She simply held out her wrists, her eyes fixed on Whitfield with a cold, piercing clarity that seemed to strip him bare. The click-clack of the metal ratcheting shut echoed off the sterile walls like a death knell. "You're making a mistake, Marcus," Claire said softly. It was the first time she had used his first name, and the familiarity hit him like a physical blow. "You're trying to bury a body that's still breathing. That never works out well for the undertaker. Get her out of here." Whitfield spat, ignoring the chill that raced down his spine. "Take her to the holding room in the basement. I'll be filing formal charges with the police and the board of nursing by the end of the hour." As the guards began to lead Claire away, the trauma bay was a sea of stunned faces. She walked with her head held high, the handcuffs glinting under the harsh LED lights. She didn't look like a criminal, she looked like a martyr. As she passed the nurse's station, she saw Nurse Miller watching, a look of profound uncertainty on her face. Claire knew what was coming. She knew that in the basement, away from the eyes of the staff, the Preston-style corruption of the hospital board would try to pressure her into silence. They would offer her money to disappear, or they would threaten her with a lifetime in prison to protect Whitfield's billing potential. What they didn't know was that they weren't bringing a nurse to the basement. They were bringing a Donovan to a fight. "Tell my father the meeting has moved to the lobby," Claire whispered to Heiress as she was led past him. Your father?" heiress stammered. But Claire was already through the double doors, the weight of the steel on her wrists a temporary burden before the total vindication she knew was only minutes away. The basement holding room was a cramped, windowless box that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Claire sat on a rigid plastic chair, the steel of the handcuffs biting into her skin every time she moved. Across from her, a hospital administrator she recognized from the high-floor payroll audits was pacing, already holding a non-disclosure agreement and a resignation letter. "Look, Claire, or whatever your name is," the administrator sighed, tapping a gold pen against the clipboard. "Dr. Whitfield is a pillar of this community. You're a first-year rookie with a flair for the dramatic. If this goes to court, he'll have 10 specialists testifying that you interfered with a life-saving procedure. Sign the papers, take the severance, and move to another state. It's your only way out." Claire looked up, a slow, chilling smile spreading across her face. "You've spent so much time protecting the pillar that you forgot to check if the foundation was rotten. I'm not signing anything. In fact, I think the person who needs to worry about their way out is currently upstairs trying to scrub Arthur Sterling's blood off his hands." Before the administrator could retort, the heavy security door behind them didn't just open, it hit the wall with a deafening thud. The security guards who had been standing guard at the door scrambled backward, their hands flying to their belts, but they froze instantly. Standing in the doorway was a phalanx of men in tailored black suits, led by a figure who radiated a level of power that made Dr. Whitfield's arrogance look like a playground tantrum. Thomas Donovan didn't look like a billionaire at that moment. He looked like a storm front. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury as his eyes swept the room, landing instantly on the silver glint of the handcuffs on his daughter's wrists. The air in the small room seemed to vanish. "Get your hands off my daughter," Thomas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the floor seem to vibrate. The lead security guard, Henderson, stammered, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. "Mr. Donovan? Sir, we were told she was a danger to a patient," Dr. Whitfield said. "I don't care if the Pope said it," Thomas interrupted, stepping into the room. The space seemed to shrink around him. "Unlock those restraints. Now. Or the next thing you'll be securing is a prison cell for the unlawful detention of the owner of this hospital." The administrator dropped his clipboard, the gold pen clattering to the floor. "The owner's daughter?" Henderson's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the key. As the metal ratcheted open and the cuffs fell away, Claire stood up, rubbing her wrists. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a general reclaiming her command. "Dad," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Arthur is stable, but Whitfield tried to kill him to save his own ego. He pushed the thrombolytics. He ignored the hit diagnosis. I have it all on the internal recording." Thomas placed a heavy, protective hand on Claire's shoulder, his gaze shifting to the terrified administrator. "I want Marcus Whitfield brought to the main lobby. I want the chief of medicine and the board of directors there in 5 minutes. And call the police, not the ones on Whitfield's payroll, but the precinct commander. We have a decade of malpractice to discuss." Thomas turned back to Claire, his eyes softening for a brief second. "Are you all right?" Claire looked down at her stained scrubs, then back at the door that led to the hospital she was about to transform. "I'm fine, Dad. But the rookie nurse is officially off the clock." She stepped past the frozen security guards and the trembling administrator, walking side by side with her father toward the elevators. The invisible heiress was gone. The truth had arrived, and it was wearing the Donovan name like a suit of armor. The main lobby of Donovan International was a cathedral of glass and steel, usually reserved for quiet handshakes and hushed conversations. But today, the air was electric, thick with the scent of an impending reckoning. Hospital staff, tipped off by the rapid mobilization of security, lined the mezzanine levels like spectators at a trial. At the center of the marble floor stood Dr. Marcus Whitfield, his white coat rumpled, his face a mask of defiant, trembling arrogance as he faced the two people he had spent months dismissing as irrelevant. Thomas Donovan stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a mountain of quiet authority. Beside him, Claire had refused to change out of her blood-stained scrubs. She wanted the board to see the cost of their billing genius. She wanted them to see the reality of the front lines. "This is an outrage, Thomas!" Whitfield shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I saved that man's life. This nurse, this girl, interfered with a complex cardiac event. If you fire me, the malpractice suits will bankrupt you. My lawyers will. Your lawyers are currently being served with a preservation order for your private server." Claire interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster with the precision of a scalpel. She stepped forward, holding a tablet that displayed the hospital's internal audit logs. "For 90 days, I'd been the invisible nurse. I've logged every near miss, every ignored contraindication, and every time you pressured a resident to falsify a post-op report to cover your tracks. It wasn't just Arthur Sterling, Marcus. It was dozens of patients over 10 years. The chief of medicine and the board of directors stood in a grim semicircle, their faces ashen. They looked at the data on the screen. A decade of systemic corruption laid bare by the woman they had treated as a ghost. "Marcus Whitfield," Thomas Donovan said, his voice dropping into a register that signaled the end of an era. "You are hereby terminated for cause, effective immediately. Your medical license is being flagged for emergency review by the state board, and the police waiting at the north exit have a warrant for reckless endangerment and corporate fraud." Whitfield looked around the lobby, searching for an ally, but he found only the cold, hard stares of the nurses and orderlies he had bullied for years. The god of surgery had been dethroned, not by a rival surgeon or a billionaire's whim, but by the very person he thought was beneath his notice. As security led him away, the silence that followed was not one of shock, but of profound, collective relief. An hour later, the media circus had begun to gather outside, but inside the quiet of the ICU, Claire sat by Arthur Sterling's bed. He was awake, his hand weakly gripping hers. "Your father told me what you did," Arthur rasped, a ghost of a smile on his face. "He wants you in the boardroom, Claire. He says it's time for the heir to take her seat." Claire looked out the window at the hospital she had spent 3 months learning to love and hate in equal measure. She thought of Heiress, the resident who just needed a mentor, and Sarah, the nurse who just needed a day off. She thought of the ghosts, who kept the building running while the titans fought for glory. "The boardroom is where you manage a business, Arthur," Claire said softly, standing up and smoothing her scrubs. "But the ER is where you save a soul." "Marcus Whitfield," Thomas Donovan said, his voice dropping into a register that signaled the end of an era. "You are hereby terminated for cause, effective immediately. Your medical license is being flagged for emergency review by the state board, and the police waiting at the north exit have a warrant for reckless endangerment and corporate fraud." Whitfield looked around the lobby, searching for an ally, but he found only the cold, hard stares of the nurses and orderlies he had bullied for years. The god of surgery had been dethroned, not by a rival surgeon or a billionaire's whim, but by the very person he thought was beneath his notice. As security led him away, the silence that followed was not one of shock, but of profound, collective relief. An hour later, the media circus had begun to gather outside, but inside the quiet of the ICU, Claire sat by Arthur Sterling's bed. He was awake, his hand weakly gripping hers. "Your father told me what you did," Arthur rasped, a ghost of a smile on his face. "He wants you in the boardroom, Claire. He says it's time for the heir to take her seat." Claire looked out the window at the hospital she had spent 3 months learning to love and hate in equal measure. She thought of Heiress, the resident who just needed a mentor, and Sarah, the nurse who just needed a day off. She thought of the ghosts, who kept the building running while the titans fought for glory. "The boardroom is where you manage a business, Arthur," Claire said softly, standing up and smoothing her scrubs. "But the ER is where you save a soul."